Hello, and welcome to Blockchain Week Day 4. Today we'll be holding a standard panel discussion, and I'll pass the virtual microphone over to our moderator, Jana Schmitz, and she will introduce the speakers. Over to you, Jana.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to the standard panel. I'm Jana Schmitz from CPA Australia, and we have Gayan Benedict joining us. Gayan is currently an industry research fellow at UTS and former CIO at the RBA. Mark Staples, Chief Technology Officer for the Digital Finance CIC and Senior Principal Researcher at CSIRO's Data 61 is also here. And then dialing in from Dubai is Loretta Joseph, currently a consultant at McDonald Nadeau. Now, Loretta, I know it's very early over there in Dubai. I hope you don't mind me kicking off by starting with the FATF recommendations. Could you tell us a little bit about the most relevant FATF recommendations for the blockchain and crypto space?
So the FA standards, nobody sort of gets this, but the FATF have been working on crypto standards since 2011. And the reason the FATF took up the rally to regulate VASPs, or virtual assets as they call them, or virtual service providers, was because no other regulator was particularly interested. And they saw a concern about money laundering and terrorism financing. So they came up with a bunch of recommendations. For AML, CTF in general, the FATF have about 40 recommendations. In 2019, they published some recommendations specifically on VASPs. So they are recommendation 15 to 21 specifically. There's some in recommendation and 10 and 15. And part of that then is what we call the travel rule. So most countries haven't really adopted the standards of the FATF to date, but the plenary came up in October 21, and they just had a plenary last week, and they're expecting countries to legislate for virtual asset and virtual assets providers for licensing and registration by February 23. So countries don't have too long, and if you're not compliant with recommendation 15 to 21, you get downgraded. So you get grey listed by the FATF. And trust me, I've been in countries which have been downgraded, and that's not a good thing for anybody economically. So recommendation 15 is specifically for countries, and it says it has a clear definition of a virtual asset. So, and I think the problem we've seen with regulation around the world, you've got securities regulators have been looking at it from a securities regulator point of view. They do what we call principal regulation. Prudential regulation comes from a central bank, but I don't think virtual assets, not being the function of money, should really be under a prudential regulatory framework other than when they're money service providers. And so from an AML CTF point of view, for money laundering and terrorism, all VASPs must comply and be registered and licensed in each country. Now, we're partially compliant in Australia because obviously AUSTRAC register all the exchanges. There's a whole lot of licensing requirements, audit requirements, a lot of emphasis put on how the VASP must be compliant. The recommendation 16 is the big one at the moment, because that is the travel rule, and that says that, like when we do banks, so when banks move money on SWIFT, when I send Jana, $20 from ANZ to Westpac, ANZ know that it's you, me, and they know that it's you. So that's how the SWIFT network works. And the FATF is saying that VASP must do this. So recommendation 16 says that all VASP must know who the beneficial receiver is and the beneficial sender of any transaction that goes across the blockchain.
Great, thanks, Loretta. Gayan and Mark, over to you. Gayan, you are the chair of the governance working group of Standards Australia's Committee on DLT and Blockchain Standards. And Mark, you represent Australia on the ISO Technical Committee on Blockchain and DLT. Now, I'm sure the audience is very interested in your views on what features and applications of blockchains require standards. Gayan, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, certainly the area that I've been focusing on in our Australian working group has been contributing to is those aspects of technology that warrant governance. And that's really about how do you use and actually deploy the technology, and how does it interoperate, and how do you govern across its interoperation across the ecosystem in which it functions. So governance is looking really at the oversight of blockchain technologies, and it really focus on things like accountabilities, decision rights, how do you manage incentives? And it's largely been an area that's been untouched so far in a lot of the focus on blockchain. Blockchain's largely been looking at technologies, interoperability, integration, definitions, the sorts of things that are very foundational to the emergence of the technology. But as it starts getting deployed and used in more and more use cases across industry and in government, then it starts becoming very much a question around how do you govern its use? How do you actually make sure that that parties' rights and responsibilities are being accommodated for and addressed? So we certainly have put a lot more focus over the last 5 years. Actually, the working group on this has been working hard. But I'm really pleased to say that just in March 1, just earlier this month itself, actually, the governance guidelines have been released by ISO, and Australia's really contributed strongly to that piece of work. And those guidelines for governance for blockchain distributed technologies are now available for anyone, individuals, organizations, developers to look at. And it provides some really good, solid guidance on the sorts of topics and considerations that should be factored into the development and the deployment of blockchain technologies. We can maybe over the course of this session, maybe unpack some of what they are. I might hand over to Mark. That's just governance, but there's certainly other aspects as well.
Yeah, so I think it's a great introduction. So Loretta's talked about some of the standards at sort of the regulatory level, and then Gayan's talked about also around governance for enterprise and ecosystems. But then coming down another level, there's like standards around just building the applications. And I think from my point of view, a lot of our research is looking at blockchain as one of the elements that you're using in the design of a broader computer system or IT system. And it gives you kind of new capabilities for decentralization and information sharing and trust in building those. But from an application point of view, if you're using it in a specific industry vertical or for information about some specific topic, it might be kind of supply chains, or it might be land, or whatever it's about. There's going to be information needs that you need to standardize and use to work in those specific application domains. And I think a lot of those standards, a lot of those kind of already exist. And so some of the work we're doing in the blockchain space is just understanding how those standards apply into the blockchain world. But there definitely are some sort of new or unique aspects of blockchain systems that are being standardized as well. So particularly around digital assets, the whole token standards. There's a lot of standards emerging around identity and verifiable credentials, and some of those things can sometimes be done without blockchain. Like there's some verifiable credentials work can be done without blockchain, but a lot of those want to work with a blockchain system, or can benefit a lot from having information sharing through a blockchain system. So there's a lot of blockchain standards emerging in this space, both for specific applications that are sort of generic applications, but also some of these sort of new opportunities that blockchain are providing. And I guess the other thing I should say is that the standards are not just about the blockchain itself. A lot of the standards are about the sort of other parts of the technical system that you're building around the blockchain. So that might be key management. That's looking at interoperation between chains, or how should oracles work? How should we get data onto chain and off chain and so on? It's a lot of, so I think there's standards at all these levels. There's regulatory levels, and there's governance, organizational levels, and then there's sort of application levels, and then underlying technical platforms as well. The whole range of standards.
Loretta, what are your views?
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny. I think we've given a really good overview, because regulation and standards coming together. So, the problem I've seen over the last 10 years is that regulators have different regulation standards. So you've got some countries refer to digital assets. You've obviously got the FAT referring to virtual assets. Some people refer to crypto assets. Everybody has these different definitions, but if you drill down, we're all talking about very much the same thing. But we haven't built a standard, a very harmonised standard regulatory framework for things that go with prudential, risk-based AML regulation and securities regulation. And I think that's been the challenge, because the internet taught us without a holistic approach, it takes a very long time for things to manage. And we've certainly seen that in standards around regulation You know, you've got the FATF talking about virtual assets, but most security regulators have been talking about digital assets. And when you break these things down, you know, effectively we need to have a common, harmonized standard system that works across the world. Because there's two problems. You know, if companies are looking for legal clarification, so they go to a jurisdiction which talks about digital assets, or they go to another a jurisdiction which is talking about virtual assets, it's very difficult them to get legal clarification of what they're doing is right or wrong. If you go to jurisdictions that don't have any sort of standards, it's very hard to passport your company back into a mature market. So it has an effect on both the ecosystem and, you know, and on regulatory frameworks globally. So I think that's an important thing. It's been coming together. My belief is, because I've been working mainly in Commonwealth countries for the last 10 years, I think the Commonwealth will crack it before the US and Europe, just because we all have the same law system. You know, we can manage to have a framework that would be quite similar but idiosyncratic to just different countries, and I think that's a good model to go down. But yeah, they're very important, because standards across regulation, about cross application, and what Gayan was talking about, now they all come together in this technology.
I might add, Loretta, I think I really like that summation. I think there's two specific aspects of distributed ledgers and blockchains that are warranting sort of an accelerated focus from regulators. One is it's inherently focusing on value. So I think when the internet first came out, there wasn't necessarily value put on the internet, and so there was less implications of things going wrong from a value and financial risk perspective. That's certainly not the case with blockchain. So I think it's got the attention of financial regulators in particular very early on in the life cycle. And that's a good thing, because their level of knowledge and specialization of this is certainly much further along than where it was at the equivalent maturity of the internet when it was launched. So I think value is a differentiation, which is driving regulatory interest and specialization. Very much so. I think the other one is it's distributed, and the distributed nature of blockchain means it doesn't have the centralization, which brings with it very locked in jurisdictional coverage. You know, any blockchain DLT centric solution by default is almost global unless it's somehow qualified by design from the very beginning. So it is forcing regulators, I think, to collaborate and look at interoperability of regulatory and harmonization of regulatory frameworks a lot earlier on than also that I think we found with the internet. So, you know, those are two drivers which are focusing regulatory attention much earlier and in a much more concentrated fashion than I think we've seen previously with many technologies.
And I think you're right, because the internet gave us the ability to transmit information across an open network. Now we can transmit value, and where there's value, there's monetary transactions and other financial markets have had regulations for a very, very long time. So when you're looking at a very new asset class, which Bitcoin and other crypto assets they're only in their first decade of their life cycle. So there is a lot to learn, but the technology and the distribution and the decentralization has changed everything from the way that we look at centralized markets and market control, and the intermediaries that we actually as regulators regulate. Because now when you take out the regulators or the intermediaries, should we regulators really be regulating peer-to-peer? So there's all these new questions that are coming up as well as we're looking at how this develops.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Let's drill down a little bit into the standard setting process. Mark, I'll start with you. In your opinion, what makes a good standard? Who needs to be involved in the standard process or in the development process, and what needs to be taken into consideration?
Yeah, and I think this sort of in a way ties into how we adopt and use blockchain in the first place. There's no point building a blockchain just for one company. Blockchains are all about helping organizations and individuals work together, and to do that they all need to somehow kind of agree to be using this system jointly in the first place. And so I say this, governance in this space is much more like international diplomacy than IT management. And what Loretta's talking about is actually international diplomacy. But the work that gets done in standards bodies is getting people in a room and talking, trying to get agreement. And so in a way, all of the work that goes into doing standards and creating standards is like doing ahead of time some of the work that you're going to need to do anyway when you're trying to adopt and use a blockchain. So the standards are already giving you something about which a lot of people have got consensus on already. And that's going to sort of reduce the cost of getting people to buy into participation and use the blockchain. So I think what that means is that the communities that are going to be involved in using and adopting these blockchain systems are the people who need to be involved in these standards conversations. So, you know, if you're an industry, in an industry sector where organizations are going to be using blockchain, you know, you should be represented or participating in the standards process.
Collaboration. I mean, I think, Mark, you and I have always talked about that. I mean, it's a very interesting thing for me where I sit, because without policymakers in the room and out with industry in the room, we can't build these standards, you know, and because policymakers are not technologists and technologists are not policymakers. And if you don't bring them together, and the internet taught us that, it's going to take a very long time to form proper standards. And I have a really good example of this. So, you know, I've often been into a number of central bank governors and a number of regulators that, you know, are not particularly happy about blockchain applications. And I always say, so have you got a Bitcoin wallet? They look at, oh, no. And I'm saying, so you're trying to regulate something that you've never used. That's sensible, isn't it? So, you know, we have to have more interaction, we have to have more collaboration, we have to have more education, and we have to have more understanding across policy, you know, industry and governments, because it's not going to work if we all don't work from the same side.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just industry should be involved. Government is, and that's, I think, something that not all government agencies really understand or appreciate enough now, is that it's the operation of government as well. Government agencies are going to be in the future operating partly using, you know, blockchain or decentralized technology, because that's a way of making the economy more efficient. So they're as an operational player in this sort of future IT ecosystem, they should be involved in the standards as well now.
I think I'll sort of contribute that. I think Australian government has been increasingly active and involved, I think, over the last several years. I mean, my initial involvement actually came through a government agency. I sense, and I think some of the announcements earlier in Blockchain Week now talk about a pretty proactive approach I think government's taking to not only managing the risks of blockchain as it merges into the economy, but also managing the opportunities and the benefits. And it's really two-sided. It's a constant challenge to balance the two. I think regulators inherently start by managing the risks because they've already got a very clear accountability of risks. But I think that does need to be weighed against a broader set of opportunities and requirements. And I think that's happening as well now. So I think, you know, we're in a pretty good place. I was really pleased that we managed to launch the governance guidelines earlier this month. And there has been Australian government contribution into the development of those global standards. And I think to both of your points, it's been interesting to see the philosophical and cultural differences across all of the different member countries that have contributed to that. But I think where we've landed has been a very pragmatic place. It's very constructive. I think most importantly, it's a living process. I think the fact that we're now seeing standards released for deployment, that's not the end of it. It's actually just the beginning, because I think now there's going to be very active consultation with industry, with individuals, with organizations about how do we evolve these things and make sure that they stay relevant and constructively useful. So that's actually a really exciting phase for us to be entering now, I think.
My dear friend Greg Metcalf has always said to me, harness the opportunity and mitigate the risk. And I think that's from a regulatory point of view, that's exactly what we try and do. One thing about standards, though, I'm just going to quickly throw this into the guys out there. I'm a 53-year-old woman. You know, when we're looking at you know, blockchain developers and people building, you know, code and stuff, I think ethically there's got to be a bit more of diversity in people writing code. Because I think, you know, the general population of the 26 to 30-year-old guys that are writing code don't understand any of the issues that I see as a 53-year-old mother as a 17-year-old kid. So if they're writing code and standards have been set around that, we really have to think about the ethics. I've been thinking about this a lot recently.
Can I just add, Mark, I think that's a very valid point. The good news perhaps is that not all the standard setters are 20-year-old coders.
No.
Certainly can vouch for that. I do think that they have to interoperate. And certainly for me, I think public awareness, communication, education is going to be critical for this next phase of DLT blockchain adoption. You know, we're going to, and I think a big part of that is making the language that we use far more inclusive. There's a lot of in-jokes and catchphrases and terminology people use just to signal your membership of the blockchain community. And that's fantastic for bringing people together, but at the same time, it actually excludes vast swathes of the population. And in order for this thing to become truly mainstream, we need to sort of create a language and inclusivity around it so everyone feels that they have a participation and involvement, maybe even just from a consumption perspective. They're not necessarily having to develop it, but if they want to use it, they're going to have to understand it.
It sounds like all of you agree on the fact that the Australian government is actually doing quite well in standard development and developing regulatory frameworks. Now, is there anything that government and regulators in Australia could do better in order to better support the blockchain and crypto sector or businesses?
Do you want my answer on that?
Yeah.
There's been many jurisdictions that have, look, to be honest, I don't think one jurisdiction's got everything right, because in the world of regulation, you've got AML, you've got securities regulation, you've got prudential regulation. I don't think any country's actually got it right in one go. I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from countries that have been very specific about tackling one problem. I think we need to work much harder in a global space, because it's a global problem. Its technology is decentralized. These companies are decentralized. But I think working and trying to set very similar and harmonized standards about regulation around the globe is going to put us at a much better point than we are now if we have these very bespoke regulatory frameworks that are different in each country. So I think, we have to take the best, learn from the best, and not use the bad stuff. But there's a lot of good stuff. And I mean, I'm working in Nigeria at the moment. I'm helping do all their vast regulatory framework, and that's a big thing, because in Nigeria we've got 100 million users of Bitcoin. 100 million. You put that in the context of Australia, and that's for Australians. And that's very problematic, because it's the biggest users of the technology on the planet. So they have very different problems, but they need very quickly a regulatory framework that works. So we've got a month to do that. And it's been interesting looking at how some of these emerging markets, because often they're looked as not being not being probably as regulated or as sophisticated as the first world. But I think we're seeing some of these bigger countries that have large populations that are young. Like if you look at a lot of the countries of the Commonwealth, most people were born after 1996. You have very tech-savvy populations, and they're moving very, very quickly because they have no choice. It's not like in the US or Europe, we can sit back and wait and see, and you see that sort of rhetoric come out of the US. But I think, if we look at some of the bigger countries, the Commonwealth, they're moving very fast because they have no choice. And I think some of the regulatory frameworks coming out are actually very, very good.
Mark, Gayan?
Yeah, I think in some ways Australia is leading. I think, for example, there was funding, federal government funding into Standards Australia to support its activities as the Secretariat leading the ISO standards for blockchain and DLT. So, and that's one way in which we're leading. I think maybe the biggest opportunity for Australia is, we're not just doing blockchain for its own sake. We're doing it because it'll give us better ways of working together, within Australia, but also with our international partners, or working for a better way for government to work with industry, for example, within Australia, or industry to work with each other. So I think the opportunity is for, government to work out their role in this space as part of the operations of the economy. Understand what blockchain. So part of it's about education and understanding what blockchain is, the opportunity for new ways of working, and how that might apply into their sector, and look for where we can sort of leverage some of the distinctive capability or economic activity in Australia. Which could be, for example, in lots of areas, mining, for example, might be one.
Look, I endorse those views. I think they're pretty much on point. I think Australia's in a unique position right now where we've got a great coming together of industry innovation. I've seen a lot of that over the last week, and I think we punch well above our weight in terms of industry innovation in this space. I think also we do very well in a research perspective. I think Australia is overrepresented in blockchain distributed ledger research, which is fantastic. And pleasingly, they are coming together. I think there's opportunities for industry to leverage that research and vice versa. I think government has a role in actually sponsoring that collaboration. And if, the three of those sort of pillars around industry research and government continue to work together. And then I think very importantly to Loretta's point, also engage globally from a harmonization and collaboration perspective. I think we're actually in a rare position of opportunity. I think, Blockchain Week for me is a great manifestation of all of those pillars coming together. And I think we're in a much better place than where we were 2 or 3 years ago. And I think it's really for us to take that opportunity going forward.
The one thing I will add on that is that I think we need to address, and the government needs to address it, how we get more investment and fund some of these companies. Because I definitely agree, we've got some of the best research and the best companies in blockchain in the world, but inherently what happens is that they find it very hard to raise money in Australia and leave. That hasn't changed. That trend's been going on for the last 10 years. So I think, we were very happy, to put holes in grounds to see if there was gold, but we're still very risk adverse, when it comes to investment, venture investment into technology. I think that really needs to change quickly, because we've got some amazing companies, and I've been very sad to see a lot of the ones that I've advised just give up and have to leave Australia. So I think we really need to change that if we are going to be a global leader.
Yeah, agree, Loretta. I think the discussion papers that have been launched earlier this week really set the right question agenda that has to be addressed over the coming years. If we can address those challenges, I think we'll be in a very good place.
I agree.
Thank you. Thanks. That was a great concluding remark, Gayan. Thank you so much, Loretta, Mark, Gayan. We have to wrap up because I can already feel Steve Fellas becoming a bit nervous. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.